And speaking of Ohio, I watched you recently when you announced the run for governor talk about how so many different things are going to be kicked back to the states. And of
Yeah,
course, new in the news, on fire, the dismantling of the Department of Education.
yeah.
I've heard this is a disaster. Oh my God. And then I've heard you talk about all the reasons this is a great thing. Can you elaborate on what's wrong and why you think that this is potentially the way forward?
Yeah, I mean, depends on what you're referring to as the disaster. If you're saying this is a disaster and that's referring to the US Department of Education, that'd be accurate because that's exactly, no, I mean, serious, that's exactly what it's been. You think about this government agency in Washington, D.C. that spends 80 plus billion dollars of US taxpayer money per year. Let's just take a big step back and measure, let's say, student achievement
Right.
over the last 20 years, student achievement over the last several decades. Are we doing well in that regard? No, we're actually not. An average seventh grade student here is at the level of an average Chinese student in third grade. Okay. 4 year discrepancy versus China, 5 years versus Singapore. An eighth grader here versus a third grader in Singapore are at the same approximate level for academic achievement and performance. So, is our federal Department of Education delivering some kind of magical result according to a national standard? Of course it's not. But to the contrary, even on first principles, I think education is best left to the states where you have competitive models in different states that innovate in different ways and experiment on how you're actually delivering for our kids. That's a great thing to have a competitive system. A federal Department of Education has actually long been a disaster and a waste of money at that. And Jillian, I'm a fan of not just, I try not to at least spout the standard, talking points for my side of an issue or a conservative talking point or whatever. It's worth on the day that it's being ordered to be dismantled to just take a step back and say, what would have been the purpose for creating this in the first place, right? Like, what was the point of creating a US Department of Education if it's been such a failure? Was there ever even a rationale for it? Even if somebody wanted to create a federal government solution to a said problem, so many of those agencies should have just been temporary task forces. Imagine if the US Department of
Right.
Education had just been a temporary task force overseeing the process of, let's just say, the integration of our schools and making sure that there wasn't racial disparities in how things were transferred from one school district to another. Agree or not, at least that would have had a finite time period that it existed. The problem with this is when you create a task force and instead turn it into a permanent agency, that agency then starts finding relatively random and increasingly, even over time, corrosive things to do, foisting ideologies onto our public schools, saying that you don't get this money unless you adopt certain racial or gender-based ideologies. There's actually one funny story, maybe we'll find it funny, maybe not, it's a little odd, that certain schools in certain central parts of the country could not get funds because they taught certain programs that were deemed outside of what was acceptable for a school to be teaching. For example, training programs in archery. Well, you know what? Maybe we don't need one standard for the entire country, but in certain parts of the country, that might make sense to have a public school that integrates that option into middle school or high school education. It belongs to locals, and education is best done locally, ultimately for each family, even being able to make the decision of where they send their kids to school. Anybody who's a parent knows that every kid is different and unique and deserves their own path. That's where education's best left, is to the decentralized apparatus of the states. And this federal Department of Education has been nothing other than an abysmal failure. And when an institution has failed that badly, there's one answer: you shut it down, return the money back to the stakeholders. In this case, it's to the taxpayers and to the states and to the people. That's a good development, but it's not the end goal either. It's not the final destination either. The final destination needs to be improving the educational achievement metrics for our students, actually solve this educational achievement crisis in our country. And if I'm calling balls and strikes, Jillian, I don't think either party has frankly done a good enough job of actually confronting that crisis, or we wouldn't be where we are.
Right.
And for my part, that's where I'm focused on the next chapter of this.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like, comment, subscribe, and share. And make sure to let me know what guests you want to see on in the future.